It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Jalie A from the School of Public Health at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. She will talk to us about behavioral economics of addictive behavior change and applications to problem drinking. Thank you very much for joining us here.
If I stand up straight, can you still hear me in the microphone or not? I'm talking, and am I going to have to do this the whole time? Okay. If I drift away from it, please let me know right away. And also, I have to warn you that I have developed really bad allergies, and the plane ride over here just got them going crazy. And so if I start to cough and cry and hack in the middle of this thing, just give me a moment and it'll settle down and I'll get back to it. I want to thank the organizers very much for inviting me to be here today, and I've enjoyed the talks so far, and I'm delighted to be a part of this. And I think that what I'm going to talk about is going to fill in a few of the gaps between the talks that we've already heard today. Let's see. Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge my collaborators at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. That is not where the football team is. That is over in Tuscaloosa. We have a bad football team. Yeah, I know. It's good to be at a place that does, to tell you the truth, because I've been at many SEC schools and it dominates everything. The two people on here, though, that I really want to give the most credit to as collaborators are Kathy Simpson and Rudy Vucinich. David Roth is the biostatistician on the project, and he will get some credit later on in the talk. And then these are other people that have been involved in some of the publications that I'm going to talk about the research from. Been supported by a lot of different agencies, mostly by NIAAA. What I want to do today in the time that we have is I want to first just kind of give people an overview of what I mean when I say behavioral economics. And I already know we have two economists in the room. Please help me out. Are there others? Oh, okay, good, there's more. I'm fundamentally a psychologist. I learned probably enough economics to become dangerous with it, but it was important to do that if I was going to work in the field of behavioral economics. So I want to talk about that. Then I want to move into applications of behavioral economics to alcohol and drug misuse. And one of the first things that you run into if you're going to work in what we refer to as an open economy, meaning not in a laboratory, if you're going to be out in the real world where everything is changing simultaneously, is measurement really, really matters, because you can't control a lot of things, but you can at least observe it well. And so one of the first things I ran into was how do we measure behavior in a meaningful way at the human level. And one of the ways that we have developed extensively is we look at what people spend their money on. It's a common metric, and when you have a big drug problem, you spend a lot of money on drugs, drug seeking, treatment, and recovering from drugs, plus lost income on occasion. And then I want to talk about a couple of lines of research that I've been involved in, one of which really focuses on low-risk drinking. How do people do that? This is something that we know occurs, but it has not been well studied, and it really is a behavioral regulation challenge to get a handle on what is going on when someone can use a drug that they previously abused, but do so in a way that does not cause problems. And then I want to finish up by talking about an intervention study where we used an interactive voice response self-monitoring platform to deliver what we refer to as an extensive intervention, which means you take your helping resource, and rather than massing it like in an acute care model, you spread it out over time so that people get a lot less, but they get it over a long period of time, which is really important when you're dealing with chronic behavioral problems that relapse and remit like addictive behaviors. The word behavioral economics has really jumped out of where it started, and I know it's been picked up in business and cognitive decision making, and I'm not sure always if we're talking about the same thing. But the line I'm talking about emerged in Harvard operant psychology laboratories and graduate students and faculty members that at one point had worked with B.F. Skinner. And what they were studying is what they refer to as intertemporal choice. And that is, how do people make decisions that involve time trade-offs? You get a little bit now, you get a lot now, you get a little bit later, you get a lot later. How do people organize their behavior through time? So fundamentally, the question is the temporal organization of behavior. And they came up with some very interesting regularities when they started looking at behavior patterning over the long run. And the first thing that they discovered was what they refer to as the matching law. And that is the relative rates of responding match relative rates of reinforcement. And a big question right off the bat is, okay, what's the interval that you're maximizing your reinforcement over? And that became a big issue in the field, and I'm not going to go there right now. But what this matching law, and R.J. Herrnstein is the person that first published on this, why it's important is that people distribute their behavior across available activities and commodities in the natural environment at the relative rates of return. So they're not always throwing everything at the highest, most reinforcing, most rewarding activity, but they're distributing it. And that's what really is sort of the empirical finding that underpins everything else I'm going to talk about today. The level of analysis is molar. And what I mean by that is they reject the assumption of temporal contiguity. And those of you that are psychologists in the room, you can remember E.L. Thorndike's law of effect about stamping in behavior. You know, response, reinforcer, connections get strengthened every time you get reinforced. They call it the correlational law of effect because what they're interested in is patterning over time, not just discrete choice between this or that right now. A really important finding in this literature is that individuals differ in their sensitivity to delayed outcomes. Everybody devalues delayed rewards. I mean, that's a very natural thing to do. $1 tomorrow is not worth as much as $1 today. That's called discounting. But the rate at which delayed value drops is your discount rate. And there are a lot of individual differences in that matter when you're looking at addictive behaviors. Another thing that is actually a bit of a tautology, but economists are very comfortable with it, is that you infer preference from relative resource allocation. Okay, so you're not necessarily getting people to tell you preference, you're looking at reveal preference and how they do their resource allocation. And another important part of this is that preference is context dependent. Every context that you make choices about how to distribute your behavior, there are different activities available at different costs or different prices, different amounts of time required, different amounts of effort. And you always have a budget line. Okay, so you have a constraint, and there are different constraints, and the question is, how are you going to distribute your behavior across those choices? Okay, this should be very familiar to some of you, especially economists. These are just basic discount curves. But what is different here, and this comes straight out of the operant laboratory, is that the discount functions between a sooner, smaller reward choice and a later, larger reward choice. Okay, good. Time going that way, reward value on the y-axis. The issue here is the curve is hyperbolic. Okay? It's not exponential, and apparently I've been led to believe that in classical economic theory, the assumption was that discounting was an exponential function, which meant these curves would never cross. And this is an empirical finding out of the operant laboratory. They are, in fact, hyperbolic. And what that means is that you get abrupt preference reversals as you get closer in time to the availability of what I'm going to call the sooner, smaller reward. The issue is how close do you have to get for that to happen? And that is describable by your discount rate. And so the person over here, they don't discount as much as the person on the right. And so they're going to have to get a lot closer to that imminent reward for the preference reversal than the person over there. And you can think about this and as choices, for example, between, let's go drink now. I mean, it wouldn't take more than, what, how many minutes to find alcohol from here? Not long. 10 minutes? I don't know. Wouldn't, 5? Okay. Yeah, and that's one of those things that's just always there. But by the way, Diet Coke is not always here. I tried to go find a Diet Coke over lunch, and I had to go a long way, I was told, to get it. You guys are very healthy out here. Okay, wait. So that's what discounting is. People who have addictive behavior problems tend to discount more, but there's still a lot of heterogeneity even among them. But one of the more, I think, important things to emphasize from this perspective is the role of time and patterning of behavior over time. And a lot of people think of a choice as a choice between two different acts. Either I'm going to do A or B, X or Y. And if you look at just that little simple, what they call a discrete choice, in this case, the reward value of Y is greater than X. So going out and partying and having a good time, if you were just given a discrete choice, may be much more preferable than something that over the long run has higher value. Come on. Oh no. Here we go. In fact, as this example shows, a pattern of X choices has higher value than a pattern of Y choices over the long run. And so one of the ways that we've come to think about this with regard to addictive behaviors is we're trying to get people to shift from making discrete choices between acts to making choices between pattern. And the question is, how do you get them from the discrete choice to the more molar choice? This perspective seems very well suited to studying addictive behaviors, alcohol and drug abuse, where the basic feature is its excessive demand for the substance. And one of the aspects of, for example, the alcohol dependence construct is that the worse your problem is, the more you're going to engage in drug seeking, recovering from drug use, the more you're going to spend on it, the more severe it is. And so that lends itself very much to looking at relative resource allocation, whether it's time, money, effort, to engaging in the substance and gaining access to it versus other things that may be more adaptive. And we think that may add new information about problem severity. So to frame this in a very simple example, for an individual who's attempting to resolve their problem or recover, the act of drinking may be preferred in discrete choice. But a sober lifestyle, or what we like to refer to as a sober consumption bundle, which includes all these other things that come along with it, over the long run has much higher value. So we're trying to go from this to trying to get them to make the more molar choice. You know, that's a challenge in trying to promote stable recovery. And fundamentally, I'm interested in success. I'm not interested in failure and relapse. I mean, of course, we all know that happens. But the issue for me is, how do people who've had these problems change their behavior and sustain it? So I've been looking at this stuff for a long time, and I've mainly been doing it through studying what we call natural recovery. And I love to say this to psychology audiences because they're so into, a treatment efficacy mode of thinking about things. This lets you study the behavior change process without the contaminating effects of an intervention. Because so much of our treatment research, at least in my area, when you talk about treatment, you're talking about promoting abrupt onset of abstinence. Okay, you're doing your problem thing and then boom, you're supposed to quit and maintain it. I mean, that's the American model of behavior change for alcohol and drug problems. If you study natural recovery processes, there's many pathways out of problem use and a lot of variability there. And most of you probably heard of harm reduction. I mean, you can reduce the harms associated with your use without necessarily stopping use. So there's a lot that's lost when you're just studying abstinence versus relapse. There tend to be, though, in terms of stability, long-term, we're talking years, 3 outcomes. There are people who sustain stable moderation. They may only have like a glass of champagne on a birthday or New Year's. They're functionally abstinent. Then you have folks who really want to be resolved, but their resolutions are not stable. And so they have periods of intermittent relapse. Typically, though, they resume behavior change and resolve again. That's very common. It's not what people often say that, one drink then drunk and you're stuck there. People change even after relapse. But the part that I'm most interested in as a behavioral regulation issue is stable non-abstinent resolutions. Like, how can people engage in low-risk drinking, the very thing that got them in trouble before, and do that over long periods of time without having relapse events? When you take a public health perspective on addictive behaviors, you realize that moderation drinking or low-risk drinking or whatever you want to call it, it is important to understand it because of the public health impact of that particular pattern. Everyone who's had a problem wants to be able to do this. Many can't, but there's still a minority of the population. Most people who will meet even clinical diagnostic criteria don't ever enter treatment, and some can achieve stable moderation. And most people learn that they can't and then accept abstinence as a goal. This is an old slide, but it gets a point, just kind of the population perspective on this. This was a Canadian national survey. The dominant pathway to resolving alcohol problems is natural recovery. These are stigmatized disorders. People do not want to enter interventions for them. They don't want that diagnostic label following them around the rest of their life. It's one of the reasons of the popularity of mutual help groups like AA. What you see here, though, is that outcomes vary hugely by whether or not you're treatment seeking or not. Now, some of this reflects problem severity, that only people with more severe problems end up in treatment because they have to go for a variety of negative reasons. But even some of them achieve stable moderation drinking. So abstinence is the majority outcome, but a sizable minority do achieve moderation, and it's typically through natural resolution. And that's what I want to study. So if you're going to look at this in an uncontrolled environment, you've got to be able to measure well. And we are interested in behavioral patterning through time, so we really want to get big snapshots of behavior over long periods of time. There's a nice interview technique in our area, the timeline follow-back interview, structured recall with calendars and recall aids, where you can get a daily drinking disposition a year back in time. And so we use that to do prior to the onset of resolution. So you can see that in this particular graph. This is the year before, resolving, onset of resolution after a particularly hard binge in this person. Then they are abstinent for a period of time. Then they resume drinking. And The post-resolution drinking is rescaled over here on the right. This is a guy, so these are the American and IAAA thresholds for low-risk drinking, which say you shouldn't drink more than 4 drinks on any single day. And this just shows the drinking that was under the safe zone threshold and over it. Got a handle on how to measure drinking. But how do we characterize the environment? And how do we make those apples and oranges kind of comparisons between, oh, am I going to exercise or am I going to drink? There are qualitative differences in activities, and if you get too hung up on focusing on like the topography of behavior, it's very difficult to resolve the comparison issues. So we decided years ago, and this is where Rudy Vucinic gets a lot of credit for having the insight in that if you're going to scale these things up to something meaningful to humans, you got to talk about time and money. I mean, because that's what we largely express our values through, is where we spend our time and where we spend our money. And so we developed an extension of the timeline follow-back interview where we used the expenditure categories in some of these federal expenditure surveys, and we looked at, during the year prior to resolving, what do people spend their money on? And we quickly realized that when you're dealing with natural recovery samples, that these are middle-income people by and large. These are not people who, their personal economies are somewhat complex, and they have a lot of expenditures that are locked down years ago. I mean, they bought a house, they make that decision to put away a certain percentage for retirement, comes out of their paycheck automatically. It's not a choice that's in current time. And we were really interested in what they're doing with their monetary resource available now. Felt that that was where the preferences would be most clearly expressed and the severity of a drinking problem would be most clearly measured. So what we did is we took their expenditure reports over the year and we came up with what we call the discretionary expenditure pool, which we included categories: alcohol, tobacco, other consumed goods, entertainment, recreation, gifts given to another, and then voluntary savings. Now, I'm not talking about the lockdown stuff. I'm talking about what you put in the bank or in some kind of savings vehicle now, which again, it's a contemporary choice. That's the denominator here. And behavioral economics says that it's the relative resource allocation where you are expressing the value of particular activities. So what we did was to look at the money spent on alcohol over the total discretionary expenditure pool, that ratio minus the ratio of money saved voluntarily of the discretionary expenditures. We did this because we felt like this would best capture kind of the temporal dimension of choice, which James was talking about earlier. You know, that you are giving up something in present time in order to have resource in the future to do something that may be of higher value or whatever. So this is what we call the Alcohol Savings Discretionary Expenditure Index, or the ASDE index. And it turns out this actually has some pretty good utility in understanding behavior patterns. Before I get into the actual data, though, let me just say that when we first did this, we did it with a very low-income, inpatient VA alcohol treatment, alcohol-dependent population way back in Gainesville, Florida. And their income was like $8,000 a year on average. There, you do not need that denominator. You can look at absolute dollar allocation to these commodities and still see these same kind of relationships, but with middle income groups that have more resource to work with and more complex economies, that we ended up realizing that we had to separate out the stuff that was not nailed down. Okay, so the first line of research that I want to talk about is how does this relate to moderation drinking? Regulating a former problem behavior in a non-problem manner. This question, those of you that know much about the alcohol field know that it was a very controversial subject since it was first documented in the literature in the 60s. There was a series of intervention studies that kept finding that people would, in fact, have moderation drinking outcomes. This became known as the controlled drinking controversy. People just didn't think it could happen because it does not fit with conventional wisdom about the nature of alcohol problems. You know, that it's a disease, and once you have it, you can't drink again. But people did research on predictors of moderation, mainly in a clinical research agenda, and these predictors have been replicated over and over and over again since about, the late 70s, early 80s. But the only new thing on here is this higher self-efficacy to resist drinks in high-risk situations. But other than that, the rest of it's been known for decades. But what we wanted to ask was, could the ASDE index add some kind of incremental utility for predicting moderation? Because we think that people who have more balanced pre-resolution monetary allocation are engaging in a form of behavioral regulation that others who don't do that don't have. And two people, and I know you've known people like this in your life, who use drugs and drink a lot, but they're very functional. They're still planning, they're still saving, they're still, working other aspects of their life, even though they may be drinking just as much as somebody their same age, same gender, and so forth. And so we wanted to see if this was a way to discriminate between those folks. The nature of the work we do is small n. We're getting a lot of longitudinal repeated measures data on people, which means you can't have monstrously large sample sizes. So we had done 3 prospective studies where we had followed people who had recently resolved, had the pre-resolution year data, and then 1 to 2 years post-resolution on the drinking pattern. We pooled those 3 study data sets so that we could get enough moderation drinking outcomes that were stable in order to look at predictors of moderation. And when we did that in this pooled data analysis, first of all, we replicated all of the already established predictors, which is a good thing. I mean, we wanted to do that so that whatever we found with the ASDE would not be attributed to something peculiar about our particular sample characteristics. And what we found was pretty much what we had predicted, and that was that those people who had resolved non-abstinent in a stable way for at least a year, and in some cases up to 2 years, they had more balanced pre-resolution monetary allocations to buying alcohol and saving money. Let me show you that. And these are the data. This is the ASDE index over here with the RNA group having lower values, which means that they had more balanced allocation patterns, which you could see over here. Now, the other thing you can see over here, which really kind of surprised us, is that the resolved abstinent group looks an awful lot like the group that has unstable resolutions. So we went back and started poking around in the literature. And as often happens, we found something Alan Marlatt had written years ago that spoke to this issue. And it sounds simple now, but it's different than the typical behavior therapy assumption about drinking. It really rejects the linearity assumption that no drinking is less than drinking some, and that that's somehow, on the same continuum all the way to abusive drinking. Alan was suggesting that low-risk drinking is a fundamentally or qualitatively different behavioral regulation process, and that abstinence and relapse may be opposite ends of the same regulation process, reflecting over and under control of the problem behavior, whereas people who are moderating are doing something different, and that they're making repetitive choices over time within a narrower band of variability. So we got to thinking about that and decided that we would see if we could come up with an intervention that would promote resolution in general, but low-risk drinking resolutions in particular. And this is the main study I want to talk about until I finish up. But before I get into the particulars of this study, I want to put this up here just to kind of step back for a minute. When you start talking about promoting behavior change from a behavioral economic perspective, especially in the alcohol and drug area, there are huge bodies of literature on the first two approaches here. The first approach, increasing constraints on the drug supply, that is the American war on drugs. I mean, that is what they do. And it's a real, straightforward, we're going to put a contingency and a cost on use or trafficking or whatever, gaining access to the drug with penalties and, international interdiction and so forth. That has effects, but it's not nearly as powerful as the effects of a demand reduction approach, which is fundamentally prevention through enriching the environment and making treatment available to reduce demand. And I don't know, there are probably not that many people in the room that are old enough to remember back in the first Clinton administration where they were proposing midnight basketball programs. And they got, laughed. I mean, that was just not going to be acceptable in the way people think about addiction. And they were going to do it, in inner cities in the middle of the night. It's a healthy alternative to what they would otherwise be doing, which is engaging in drug use and drug trafficking. That's an example of environmental enrichment. If you can increase the competing activities, it will have an effect on reducing the substance use. And there's wonderful animal model research on this. Marilyn Carroll at Minnesota has just done some amazing things to show that environmental enrichment or demand reduction has the desired effect. I'm going to be working mainly within the domain, which is very typical of psychologists, of, we're going to fix something. We're going to remediate that choice bias. There's something wrong, and we're going to go fix it. And in this case, the obvious target is to try to reduce delayed discounting and to lengthen the time horizons over which behavior is allocated. To try to get people to shift from an act choice, discrete choice, to choosing between patterns of behavior. This has an effect, and I'll show you in a minute. But again, James has already talked about this when he was talking about changing default options to get people to do what's best for them. I refer to that as manipulating the architecture of choice more broadly. I think this is really fascinating, and I think there's already some good applied examples of this out there. In the alcohol and drug treatment area, this whole treatment on demand strategy, which you started out here in the San Francisco area, is a great example of using or exploiting the alcoholic or addicts' shifting preferences between engaging in drug use and recovering to help them. So if the treatment is right there and they can go get it the day they feel like they want to stop, and you don't put up a waiting delay, and you don't have other barriers to treatment, and they can just go when they have the impulse to go, that's an example of using the choice context to set it up so that the option, the impulsive option, is actually the beneficial option. Another example of this from work that people are doing at UAB and the Center for AIDS Research that they're really trying to push for as a national policy is this opt-out strategy for HIV testing, where you get tested routinely unless you opt out of it. And you can opt out, but again, it takes more effort to do that, and they're hoping that that will therefore be the more costly choice and that people will go ahead and accept the testing. And I'm sure there are other examples. You've already talked about some with savings behavior and so forth. How long? Okay, we're good. All right, just checking. So we designed a study that what we wanted to do was to come up with an intervention that would stabilize otherwise natural recovery. You know, we wanted to work with people who would not cross the clinical threshold for care, who weren't going to AA, but to try to be able to offer them something that would be available easily on a daily basis, and we wanted to offer this during the early months of recovery when the risk of relapse is high. Oh, 10, you were wrong, okay. I was wondering about that, okay. And we decided to do this using an interactive voice response self-monitoring platform that doesn't require entry into the treatment system, and you just got to have a phone. And the way we thought about allowing them to self-monitor and use the IVR system, which had some other supportive behavior change features built into it, was that that would be a daily act that they can engage in that would promote the choice of a longer-term pattern of sober behavior. You know, it was kind of bridging the temporal gap, if you will. And we also thought that having this available may be most helpful to those who want to maintain a non-abstinent resolution, because they're also making intermittent frequent choices about whether or not they're going to drink and not to drink too much, as opposed to those who, you know, have that brute force self-control thing, I'm not going to drink. And again, going back to Marlat, we figured that those who were going to relapse would look more like those that successfully abstained, at least during our 24-week self-monitoring interval. Just want to mention, though, a few things about using an IVR platform. I work in a very poor state that has a lot of rural areas. Even so, the vast majority of people have phone access on a daily basis, so this is something they can do. I think psychologists in particular often get seduced by technology and want to make it more complicated. And, you know, with smartphones now we can do that, but back when we started this, a web-based application where I live was just not going to work. The other thing I like about it is that it does promote the collection of very high-quality data in near real time. The key to that, though, is you've got to ask people about observable events and behavior. You can't be asking them to do ratings and making mental subjective judgments about things. And you have to train them really well before they start doing this so that it's real clear to them what they're reporting on. And if you do it that way, you can get, you know, very reliable data about a lot of particular things that relate to drinking. And usually, if they'll do it at all, that's a qualification, they like doing it. It's well received. We have to recruit people directly from the community. You know, we don't want people that are coming through some kind of mutual help group or treatment program. And so we do this mainly by media-based advertisement in a lot of different newspapers and television ads. Radio doesn't work as well. We've tried Facebook, all over the Southeast, and we basically go to them to do the initial interview. And we recruited a sample that looks like this. They've been resolved on average 2.3 months, and what I mean by resolved is they either were below that NIAAA low-risk drinking threshold for at least 30 days. We didn't want people who just quit. The relapse risk was too high, and we wanted to have a reasonable number of people who succeeded. But they all had a problem duration of over two years or greater. So, and they met, I think, all but maybe one person, DSM criteria for alcohol dependence, which really isn't that hard to meet if you drink at all. Good gender, sorry, it's, especially for women, it's not. You're only supposed to have one drink a day. Large African American percentage of our population, that reflects where we live, and a good gender distribution that's not unlike what you see. And oh, this isn't going to work. Okay. Study design, randomized to either get IVR for 24 weeks or assessment-only control. And we did a follow-up interview at the 6-month, and then we continued it. But these data are based on the 6-month back to when they had their resolution event. These were our predictors. The main thing that we added in this particular study was the well-established temporal discounting task that people like Warren Bickel have used extensively, which involves those hypothetical choices between money amounts, different amounts over different delays. Yields a K parameter, which is the slope of the discount function. Very important measure in this particular research area. Categorize people in the drinking categories that I've described before, plus a missing category. Did the study, made IVR available for 24 weeks, and immediately realized, and we'd seen this before, that there's tremendous variability in the extent to which people utilize the IVR. Okay, so this is what happens with an extensive intervention. There are multiple opportunities to choose to engage or not. And it's not like you're just in treatment and then you're not in treatment. And we knew immediately we were going to have to take this into account in terms of the analytic modeling. And we decided empirically there's a nice little natural line of fracture here above and below 70% utilization. We decided that most clinicians would agree that 70% was adequate exposure or dosing with the treatment. So we chose that. We also looked at 50, and the results weren't as clean, but similar trends. Okay. There's a new data analytic tool out there in M+, called Complier Average Causal Effect Analysis. It's a little bit different than propensity scoring. It uses all available data, but what it does, it models predictors of utilization or compliance with the treatment and uses that as part of the model to evaluate intervention effects. And when you're dealing with an extensive intervention like we had, 168 days of potential call behavior, this was very well suited to it. So we use this. It's much less conservative than an ITT, intention to treat analysis, when you're dealing with an extensive intervention. And we use that. And first of all, just to put this in context, these were the identified predictors of IVR utilization. Older people, those that were less impulsive, had lower discount rates or log K, and they showed more pre-resolution sober days, some more variability but control over drinking, but they still were drinking very heavy. Don't want to convey that they weren't. But that's what predicted whether or not they call the IVR. And so you're saying, well, that's just a typical good prognosis patient. Of course they would comply, and they did. And the dropout typically happened with binge drinking, and it was pretty abrupt. Case model, you can see here, these all significantly related to compliance or IVR utilization. RNA was the referent. We were looking here at the log odds of, if you're going to make me quit, can I have 5 more minutes? Because I can finish in 5. Okay, I promise. I'm really getting very near the end. Replicated the same ASDE effect that we've been seeing all along. It looked like this. In other words, the less well-balanced your ASDE index was between savings and spending money on alcohol, the less likely you were going to engage in moderation drinking. That's what this shows. So remember that. But then we also got a group, and there was no IVR group main effect in what I showed you before, but here we also got a group by baseline ASDE interaction. And what this shows is that the IVR effect on the log odds of resolved abstinent or non-abstinent, which is, again, we're interested in success, was moderated by the ASDE index for compliers in the predicted direction. Not that we really predicted this, but we had a good idea. What this shows is that the less well-balanced your allocation was pre-resolution, so the relatively more you were spending of your discretionary expenditures on alcohol relative to savings, that if you would engage in the IVR, the more you engaged in the IVR, the more likely the odds were that you were going to be able to maintain stable, low-risk drinking. So people who are bad prognosis candidates for a moderation resolution at baseline, if they did the IVR, they were more likely to be resolved non-abstinent. So to summarize, we really can't tell the causal relationships between the ASDE and the outcome. We don't know if actually doing the IVR self-monitoring is what led to the outcome, or if people who are actively trying to moderate use the IVR, but clinically or public health-wise, it doesn't matter. But I'm sure somebody can do that research and let us know, and I think that's important to know theoretically. But what this shows is that people that will use the IVR in general tend to be the good prognosis folks, but if you can get a bad prognosis person to do it, they will have an improved probability of low-risk drinking outcomes. This is probably not worth going into given the time. It's of interest to people in behavioral economics, but one of the things that we really were startled by was the discontinuity between the K parameter and the ASDE index. And we've kind of come to think of it as the difference in the amount of behavior that it's capturing. That analog task is really kind of a state measure of your preference structure like right now, whereas the ASDE is many, many choices over a year or more. And one predicts outcomes, that's the ASDE, and then the discounting is more predictive of whether or not you're going to call the IVR. There's clearly more work to be done on understanding what we refer to as behavioral impulsivity, which is very different than personality conceptualizations of impulsivity. So to wrap up, for real, going back to the public health point of view, one of the options in public health is do nothing. Some of these people will recover even if you don't do anything. And those of you that work in the area of medical decision making and take that societal accounting perspective, this may be the rational choice under some conditions. Another approach, though, is to go ahead and target those high-risk folks that are out there in the population that never come into clinical or treatment or AA samples, and then offer them these low-intensity, extensive interventions that can function as a behavior change tool and offer them something other than a mutual help group experience. I've already mentioned the use of choice architecture. Lowenstein's work on asymmetric paternalism is lovely. That concept is that you set the defaults and the choice such that it doesn't constrain the choice of people who don't have the problem, but it helps the people that do. And then lastly, you really need to think about whether it's worth, from a societal accounting perspective, should we pay people to give you clean urines and clean breath tests? The cost averted to doing this may more than pay for itself in allowing the chronic accumulation of harms and cost by having them continue to use and the crime and everything else that goes with it. So to end, I want to leave you with these two quotes. And this is really to encourage you to take a consumer perspective on intervention. And you got to remember, these people that are out there who have these problems, they're making choices, and they're making choices. Are they going to go into treatment, which is costly in many ways, or are they going to continue to use and whatever? And so we need to think about these essentially as economic goods that are evaluated in a marketplace, and to approach our treatment designs and systems in that way. And then this last one is a quote from Alan Marlet's harm reduction book. You make it as easy to get services as it is to get drugs. So I will stop, and thank you for the extra minutes.
So we have a little less than 10 minutes for questions.
So was curious as to what the intent to treat effect actually was, because it seems to me that as a policymaker thinking about paying for this stuff, actually it's the intent to treat effect that I'm really interested in. Either that, or I get everybody to fill out surveys ahead of time to tell me, who's going to be more of a responder or not. And so, what was the intent to treat effect?
Nothing. There was no intervention effect there either.
Okay.
We replicated all the usual predictors, including the ASDE, but it had no effect in the intention to treat analysis, which includes all those people who functionally did not get exposed to the intervention. And that's a big issue, is how do you incentivize exposure?
Yeah, I guess I find that result to be fairly discouraging then. Maybe I'm a glass half empty kind of guy.
I think the bigger question is, how do you incentivize it? I mean, how do you create a set of incentives that will get them to utilize the service? I mean, in this particular area, the barriers to using services are enormous because of the stigma and in many cases, financial consequences of having to go into intensive treatment. But part of the reason I'm motivated to get into this area from a public health perspective is so you can get people to use services that are less intensive and they don't have to quit drinking the rest of their life, so that they'll use them sooner, like adolescents. I don't know how many of you have had experiences with trying to get an adolescent to go into an abstinent-oriented inpatient treatment program. I mean, I think you have to balance that with the harms and cost of leaving it untreated or without intervention. It's going to cost you something somewhere.
Yeah, I guess I'm confused because I thought that in that study there were no direct barriers to using the IVR because everybody had it on their smartphone. So it seems like you
just
need
a regular phone. It's just
or a regular phone.
Yeah. No, not everybody will do this, okay? And I think that's another research question, is who will do this? And that comes down to an issue of market segmentation. You don't expect any one intervention to be equally appealing to all of the population. And I think that, what this suggests is that you can identify that subgroup that will utilize and benefit from this, but you're going to have other things for other people. Spectrum of services.
Yeah, really interesting work, and I imagine very political work because of I know there's been a lot of pushback on the idea of controlled drinking and harm reduction. So it'd be interesting to hear sort of some of the backstory about kind of the research and how you're able to do that, because I would imagine there might be some challenges involved. And I'm just thinking, the example you gave, there's certainly a lot of work being done now on using different kinds of technologies for self-monitoring, and so people can kind of set up their goals and check in. And I'm just curious to kind of hear, more about, more about that, and sort of putting the control, having people choose from a menu of options. But it also, in reference to the last point, I think there's certainly in a lot of there is a focus on sort of where people are, and if you take a sort of stages of change. So the idea that it's not one size fits all makes a lot of sense. But anyway, so any of the above, if you feel like commenting on.
I do, and the euphemism now, the term of art, if you will, at SAMHSA, is through any door, as opposed to calling it harm reduction. It's still the notion of meeting people where they are and, promoting risk reduction. But they don't like the word harm reduction in the United States, but go across the pond and you can talk about it all you want. I mean, it's active drug policy in many countries over there. Again, we have a very strange set of drug policies and perspectives in this country. It's a very American perspective. It's kind of puritanical at times. So yes, it can be very political, and we don't use the word controlled drinking anymore, and the Sobels, who were the heart of that controlled drinking controversy, slapped me for using the word moderation in a recent publication, and they said, don't use that word, use low-risk drinking. At least that's, more compatible to a public health umbrella, and it is part of the NIAAA guidelines now on drinking. So data have mattered. It's taken 30 years, but it's there. I mean, it's arrived as a viable option. Yes?
What's the status of the old idea that there's these individual differences in sort of risk for alcoholism, and there's some people who have to be abstinent, and it's the only way they can control their drinking. And then there are others, either by Dane of genes or something, who might be able to do the social drinking. Is that idea still kicking around?
Yes, and it's very well supported, but the people who are biologically, I'm not just going to say genetically, but biologically predisposed to be primed for establishing rapid dependence and reinstating dependence, they are a small minority of the population. I'm looking back there at Mitch, who does research in this area as well. I also think that there's some huge differences there with abuse of pharmaceuticals, that have actual brain receptor sites that it just locks right into, OxyContin and things like that. Their dependence can be established so much more quickly in so many more people and reestablished rapidly. But drinking it's a little tiny molecule, okay? It's pretty much like water. And I kind of call it a promiscuous molecule because it goes all over your body. And they don't have those kind of specific receptor sites for it in the way that they do for other drugs. And then there are other metabolic things that are going on, like your liver. And, there are racial, ethnic differences and tolerance for alcoholic beverages. So yes, all of that is, part of, if you will, the whole context of what here I'm really talking about, behavioral regulation.
Just one little follow-up.
Yes.
Since we're interested in these two times in the lifespan in particular in this group, and one of the things, so, you might say, well, are there different strategies that would be more effective for adolescents to get drinking under control and for older people? But the thing that's interesting about alcohol is that you also have alcoholism that's going along over time, and in many long-term drinkers, you have their bodies have been changed in powerful ways. So, how do you just briefly? How do you think about treatment? At these two particular critical points in the lifespan, do you think about it differently for adolescents and for people, let's say, who are drinking and are now in their 60s?
The one thing I can, just as a general statement, is elasticity of demand for substances like tobacco and alcohol is greater at younger ages, which means it's more price sensitive. So interventions that are altering the relative price of engaging are probably going to be more effective with people who are younger. When they get older, they tend to have more established patterns, and God only knows what it's done to their bodies. They're less sensitive to those sorts of things. And in some ways, I think it's harder to change, but they also have more to lose. And if you go back to those original discount curves, that later, larger reward, most older people have one of those. And that can exert powerful effects on current behavior. Adolescents don't tend to have those in the same sort of way. That I think over time, it changes if you have any successful functioning as an adult. And the other thing we do know is that the discount rate changes reliably as a function of age, and from childhood to adolescence and then into adulthood. And there are many older people whose time horizon, if you will, goes way beyond their own lifespan. Their behavior is governed by future generations and leaving wealth and so forth. And I guess I do just want to say, though, that one of the things that I have really come to appreciate about looking at this stuff, and I think this came up in the first talk today, is the notion of flexibility. I think that's what mental health and health is all about, because there's some circumstances where you should be impulsive. It's adaptive. I don't think we want to get into the idea of thinking that being under control all the time is necessarily a good thing. Under certain context, the impulsive choice is the more adaptive choice. And I think it's a mistake to think that all we should be doing is remediating the impulse tendencies of adolescents. They experiment. I don't think we would have pioneers and people like that if we didn't have at least that kind of heterogeneity in the gene pool of people who are willing to get out there and take the risk, even if they die. It benefits others. Okay, she wants me to stop.